Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday night's study on the book of Hebrews. My name's Simon Lissack. I'm here with Fiona Sabala. Some of you are new and don't know us, but we are missionaries serving with Chosen People Ministries in the UK, although Fiona is currently in Berlin, but she'll be back. So welcome, everyone. And it's a great delight to be able to follow on from last week's first session on the book of Hebrews. And I think I wanted to start just by saying a few things about the book. It has historically often been used as a polemic against Judaism. It's been used to say that the old has gone, the new is here. Hurrah for the new, and we can forget the old. And I think we're going to see that the text doesn't warrant that. In fact, it's almost like it's almost the opposite. Instead of a book that is all about the cancel culture, to cancel the culture of the Old Testament, to use kind of modern language, what we're embracing here is continuity. So it's a book that embraces continuity for a reason. I was reminded, I think last week, I was driving home and got caught in some very heavy rain and then some very strong sunshine. And I saw first I saw a rainbow, and then I saw a double rainbow. And whenever I see a rainbow, I remember obviously that this is God's way of saying that he keeps his covenant promises. And he delightfully writes these covenant promise guarantees in the sky as a bow. And on one occasion, in fact, I even saw an inverted rainbow, which was really quite remarkable, staggering thing to see. But this book, more than anything else, is a book for believers. It's a book for a particular kind of believer, and I'm hoping that some of you, I'm hoping that it's all of us. It's a book for believers who find that there is a gap between what they believe and what they experience. There's a gap between what they believe and what they experience. I think this book, it's not named who wrote it, but we can tell from the way that it's written that the person writing it knows his audience. In fact, he knows his audience very well. And last week, Fiona and I, we talked briefly about the date of this book. And we both believe, we can't be certain, but we both believe that it was before the destruction of the temple. So you've got to ask yourself, what is this book? What is it for? What is it doing? And where I see it being the most useful is if I was, let's say I was a priest serving in the temple in Jerusalem, and I came to faith, maybe with one of the many Jewish scribes and Pharisees that did come to faith as we read through the Gospels. Maybe I was Nicodemus's bagman and came to faith after he explained the Gospel to me. Now, we would then be Nicodemus and I got thrown out of our offices, stripped of our robes and everything else, and we're now meeting in a scruffy little sort of manger with nothing. Nothing but this certainty that Jesus is the Messiah promised in the scriptures. And if we poke our heads out of this tiny little window past the donkey, we can see the temple up on the top of the hill with all its glory and all its kind of majesty and all the sacrifices and the kind of centralness of it. And I think what Hebrews does more clearly than any other book is teach us about the greatness of the Son. Greatness of the Son of God. Hebrews presents us with a real world that most people think of as imaginary. It's particularly true. It's particularly true in this first chapter. There's an unseen world that's more real than anything we can touch or feel or even see. And that's the world that we're being asked to look at in the beginning of Hebrews. Because the people here are believers, which I think explains why there's not a great deal of effort made to prove. It's written for people that believe that Jesus is the Messiah, Jewish people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but are struggling with their experience of what it means to be a Christian. Because so far, their experience of what it means to be a Christian, a Hebrew Christian, a Jewish believer, a Messianic Jew, so far their experience has been persecution. It's been an experience about loss. And when we as Christians are in a period where we're experiencing loss or persecution or disaster or enemies or hassle or broken wrists or shoulders, we're reminded to look up beyond our circumstances to the God who's made us promises. And that's what the beginning of Hebrews does so well. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven, so that he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. So I don't know if we'll get to the end of that little chunk, because there are at least 8 things to be said about the first 3 verses. At least 8. Let me tell you what the 8 are if you're a person that likes writing them down. The first is that Jesus is God's ultimate word for the last days. The ultimate word for the last days. He's God's eternal Son. He's God's appointed heir. He's the agent of creation. He's God's glory. He's the perfect representation of God. He's the cosmic sustainer. And he's God's unique sacrifice. And that's all in 3 verses. And there's probably more to be seen. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times in this is continuity. There's a phrase frequently in the Tanakh about, the God of our forefathers, or God that our forefathers didn't know. Here, we're saying in the past, the writer of Hebrews says that God has spoken at many times and in various ways, through written word, through the prophets that Fiona talked about last week. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by our Son, who he appointed heir of all things. This is the first time in the book that we see this Son. His Son. God has a Son, which immediately challenges us to think, how can God have a son? And that's why Islam and Judaism have developed this strong thing. God cannot have a son, because Christianity from the very beginning has been talking about God's Son. And when it seeks to prove God's Son, it doesn't turn to the New Testament, but it turns to references that can be taken from Psalm 2. Many of you will know Psalm 2. We actually looked at it, I think, last summer, about a year ago. It's the psalm that begins with a picture of the nations raging and the rulers fighting against God and his Messiah. It's a messianic psalm. And in this messianic psalm, it says from verse 4, the one enthroned laughs at this and scoffs at this rebellion. He says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I've become your father. Ask, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You'll rule them with an iron scepter and dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and he be destroyed on the way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. And I think I remember last time saying that the only person that God ever says in Scripture to take refuge in is himself. So in this one psalm, we've got the statement that it's messianic, and that this Son who is going to rule, you can take refuge in him, against implying that he is God. And that's what we're going to see as we go through this. So first we see that the Son is our only hope in these last days. So what does the last days mean? It means that we're in the last section of God's plan for the rescue of the world. It's not the last day when God will come and judge, but we've passed a significant point, and the significant point is the point at which the eternal Son of God became flesh and dwelt among us. This Son in verse 3 is verse 2, is appointed heir of all things. Now, normally when we think of somebody being an heir, I guess the most famous example might be Prince Charles. He's heir to the throne. He's also the Prince of Wales. He's also Prince Charles. He's also the father of 2 boys. This appointment as heir of all things could sound like it was given to him after he did something. But it says next, through him, he made the universe. So God made the universe through the Son. But we know that God made the universe by speaking in Genesis 1. So we should rightly be disturbed, if you like, by this. Because as God reveals himself to us, there's a joy in the mystery of the Trinity and of the God of the Tanakh and the New Testament and the God that became flesh and dwelt among us. Religion is always trying to simplify. It can't deal. Religion cannot deal with mystery, but the living God can. And part of the reason we can trust him is because he's so beyond our own imaginations. And so we learn that the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. This radiance again is the Genesis 1 power, brightness. It's the light that God brings into our lives and reveals truth to us, shows us the way, shows us his love and his compassion and his mercy. It says of Jesus that he was the image of the invisible God, and that he revealed God's glory to us. And he did that by dying for us on the cross. he's also the exact representation of his being. When it says the exact representation, it has in mind the idea of a seal, a sort of when you put a seal into wax, the image on the wax is exactly the same as the image on the thing. They're the same. So this Son is revealed to us in the flesh as the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. So the Son not only created the universe, but he sustains the universe. He holds everything together. Again, the Greek has the idea of him bearing the universe, like Charles Atlas. You know the picture of Charles Atlas with the world on his back. Well, he hasn't got the world on his back. He's got the universe on his back. And again, in the Hebrew, in the Greek rather, it's worlds. It's all the worlds, which meant more to a Hebraic mind, which generally split things into sun, moon, and stars, heaven and earth, made those kinds of divisions. But for a modern person, the best way to think of it is the universe. So he sustains all things by his powerful word. I was watching the tennis, and there's a rather I'm back again. Yeah. So I was just saying, when the eternal Son put on the mask of human flesh, then we saw his true self in a way that we couldn't see him otherwise. If we are honest, we are most like Jesus when we're most aware that we're visible. When you've got a T-shirt on saying Jesus made me kosher, or Isaiah 53, read the chapter, it'll change your life. If you've got that on you, you're very visible and you're very aware. If you're a religious Orthodox Jew, you're very visible when you're outside your community because you dress completely differently. But when the Son is revealed to us, he reveals to us the exact representation of his glory and this incredible light and this incredible power that sustains every molecule in the world. And to be so powerful and to choose to become a sacrifice, to be executed in the most brutal way, is a shocking demonstration of just how different and how differently motivated he is from us. So after sustaining all things by his powerful word, it says, after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. This is the unique sacrifice that Jesus has made, and the sitting down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven tells us that it's complete, that it's final, that it is finished, that Jesus uttered on the cross at Calvary. But instead of seeing a bloody beaten body on a cross, we see that his sacrifice put him at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. And to sit at the right hand, if you remember, that was the request, wasn't it, of Peter and James. They wanted to sit at Jesus's right and left. Well, that's not really what's in sight here. In sight here is a throne on which the Son sits. So he doesn't, although he is sitting he's separate from God the Father, he sits on the same throne. And it is because he sits on that throne that his name is superior to the angels, as the name he's inherited is superior to theirs. Because, as it says in verse 14, angels are ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. This next section is entirely dedicated to an elongated discussion about angels. It may seem irrelevant to us in kind of 21st century modern, the modern West, with technology and houses and electricity and gas and cars that start every time and electric cars and Zoom meetings where people can gather and see each other and talk in a video conference. All these things, they are the things we've become to rely on. But in the ancient Near East, during the 1500 years, certainly that from the beginning of the book of Genesis to the intertestamental period, angels were a fascinating subject. And the Jewish people had a very sophisticated level of understanding about angels, different purposes, different processes, different names. It was very kind of well developed. And what the writer of the Hebrews wants us to be sure of from the very beginning is that Jesus is not a messenger. He's not an angel. And so that's why he'll spend so much time at the beginning of the book lifting Jesus above the angels. So he's already told us that after the purifications of for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty of heaven. The best picture I can offer you of what that might look like is in the book of Daniel in chapter 7, where in verse 9 the Ancient of Days takes his seat, and his clothing is as white as snow, and his hair, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was like flaming fire, and his wheels were ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, the books were opened, and as I continued to watch, I saw in verse 13 a vision that looked like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given all authority and glory and sovereign power over all peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. That is Daniel chapter 7. The main part of that is verses 13 to 14. But the quote in verse 5 is from Psalm 2, which we read from before. You are my son, today I have become your father. Or if you're a King James person, it's going to say that you are my son, today I have begotten you. And begotten Begotten's a difficult, I think it's a difficult thing to understand. We sing a song in church, begotten, not created. And we all sing it very confidently, but I'm not so sure that we really know the difference between created and begotten. So in these situations, I tend to fall back to C.S. Lewis, and he said a very helpful thing. He says a bird makes another bird. A bird begets another bird, but makes its own nest. A bird begets another bird, but it makes its own nest. So in the park near where I live, there's a river, and the birds are busy building nests with their chicks bouncing out of this. They're bouncing out into the river now, causing trouble. But it's the bird begets the bird, and the birds are of the same essence of each other. But the difference is it makes the nest out of bits of wood, bits of leaves, bits of moss, bits of all sorts of things. Some of them are really quite sophisticated, but they're nothing as sophisticated as a bird. And what we are saying when we're looking at this father-son relationship is that this is the relationship that has always been described throughout the Tanakh. And the writer of Hebrews is looking back to those promises and saying, this father-son relationship has always been there. And what we're seeing is the son and the father are different, but of the same substance. That's how he's able to be the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his being. And then you'll see there's a pair. It says, or again, I will be his father and he will be my son. Now, this seems like a repetition, doesn't it? I mean, it's just saying exactly the same thing. You're my son, today I'll become your father. Or, again, I will be his father and he will be my son. Except it's not saying the same thing at all. It is plucking a reference out of 2 Samuel 7:14. 2 Samuel 7:14 is where it's quoting from. And just to paraphrase it, David's become King David has kind of brought Israel to this high point in its history. And he feels a bit guilty and says, I think I better go and build a big house for you because you've given me so much. And he checks kind of with Nathan and says to Nathan, do you think this is a good idea? And Nathan seems like he didn't really pay too much attention, just said, yeah, do whatever the Lord lets you do. Maybe he was a bit scary like Bush, or maybe, I don't know why. He doesn't seem to pay too much attention. Anyway, he goes off having said do it. And then God speaks to Nathan something very important. He says, first of all, he does this lovely thing where he kind of takes him. He says, I saw you as a shepherd, and I took you from being a shepherd to being this great king. But then he says, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your father, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, you might think that the son in question here is Solomon, because Solomon is the one who built the temple. But David was still alive when Solomon was crowned. So it can't be Solomon, just from that. And also, it can't be a descendant who is not eternal, because his kingdom and his throne last forever. So somehow we have to find a descendant of David who is eternal, who will sit on a throne and rule a kingdom forever. That's what's being added to our picture here. So the writer of Hebrews has brought together Psalm 2 and 2 Samuel 7:14 to begin to paint for us the fact that the Messiah will come from the house of David to bring a kingdom that is forever. The next verse is verse 6. And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. In speaking to the angels, he says, he makes the angels winds and his servants flames of fire. But about the Son, he says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever, and the righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom. When he says God brings his firstborn son into the world, immediate panic. God brings his firstborn son into the world sounds as if he wasn't there at the beginning. And we know from scripture that he was. So what exactly does he mean by the firstborn? Paul uses the phrase, he's the firstborn over all creation. The firstborn is a statement about his honor and his position and his office. And when it's almost as if I'm trying to think of it. I don't know if this is a great example, but we're looking at the Father, and the angels are in the court worshipping the Father, and then the Father brings in the Son who was just behind him, and they stand together. And at that point, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Now, we're very familiar, I think, with the idea you'll see in Revelation that John falls down to worship an angel and he's told not to do it, to get up. They say, I'm a man. Da, da, da. The only person who can be worshipped like this in Scripture is God. So we see God's angels worshipping him. We see this heavenly courtroom full of angels. It's so described so clearly in that Daniel verse that I read to you, thousands upon thousands. You'll see this great cloud of witnesses, to steal something from Hebrews later on, of angels worshipping him. And in speaking of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire. I think the picture here is his angels are like wind or like fire. They're temporary, they're non-physical, and they're here and they go. They're temporary, not permanent. But about the Son, he says, your throne, again, is this picture of this. Now it's this very strong picture of kingship. Your throne, O God, it's theos, it's the word for God, will last forever. This Son is going to produce a kingdom that will last forever, that is characterized by righteousness. In fact, it's so much characterized by righteousness that righteousness will be a scepter of your kingdom. The scepter is the symbol of the king. Well, we saw this, all the things being brought out with the Queen's celebration of her Jubilee. We saw scepters being brought in, but this king's scepter is righteousness. And again, righteousness is a very clear picture of how of the character of our God. So, just to recap, you can see in this initial chunk of chapter 1 that what the writer of Hebrews wants to do is a kind of, it's a bit like today. Novak Djokovic was playing this guy called Sinner. Sinner's ranked 25, Novak is ranked 1. He should have walked it, but he lost the first two sets. Hebrews, and then when he was interviewed afterwards, he said, I went into the loo, I went into the toilet, looked at myself in the mirror and gave myself a talk, a little motivational talk. And then he came out and he won the next three sets, 6-3, 6-2, 6-2. I think being Christian is a bit like, sometimes it feels like we're Novak Djokovic, 2 sets down. And what we need to do is we need to take ourselves away and remind ourselves about how great our Saviour is. And once we've got that back in place, and that's what Hebrews is going to do for us as we go through it, then we can come out, remember who we are, and breeze through the last 3 sets and come out 3-2. He was strangely playing a guy called Sinner, who was knocked out today. But we are the sinners that'll never get knocked out. We might get knocked out of a game, or we might miss a few backhand cross courts. We might get foxed by a lob or a drop shot, but we'll never be out of the tournament. Our victory is guaranteed because of the greatness of our God and his sacrifice, which here is described as he provided purifications for sin. He sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. And Hebrews is going to tell us later that because of where he went and what he did, we can be entirely safe and secure in our salvation. And I think I'm going to stop there before I get into any more of the text. I don't want to take up any more.